The Appalachian Mountains have a way of swallowing the sound of a human heart, leaving only the oppressive weight of the cold and the ancient trees for company. For Elias, this isolation was exactly what he had been searching for when he drove up the winding, ice-slicked roads to his family's remote cabin. It was 2 in the morning, the dead of night, and the world outside was a monochromatic landscape of white snow and black shadows. Inside, the silence was so thick it felt physical, like a heavy blanket pressing against his chest. Elias sat by the dying embers of the fireplace, clutching a glass of room-temperature water, his eyes fixed on the frost patterns crawling across the window pane. He had come here to escape the noise of the city, but more importantly, to escape the noise of his own mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flickering lights of the highway and heard the screech of tires. He saw his brother's face in the passenger seat, a look of sudden, sharp realization just before the world turned upside down. The guilt was a parasite, feeding on his memories, reminding him every second that he had survived while his brother had not. He believed that if he had been faster, if he had reacted just a second sooner, the accident would have been nothing more than a close call. The silence of the cabin was suddenly broken by a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a whistle, low and melodic, echoing through the timbered walls. It was not the wind or the shifting of the old foundation. It was a specific tune, 5 notes, that rose and fell in a pattern he knew better than his own name. It was the signal his brother used to give him when they were children, a secret code used to find each other in the dense woods or to announce that the coast was clear. Elias froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He told himself it was impossible. His brother had been gone for 6 months, buried under 6 feet of earth in a cemetery hundreds of kilometers away. Yet the whistle came again, clearer this time, originating from somewhere deep within the house. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and a battery-powered lantern from the side table. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet as he moved toward the kitchen. As the beam of his light swept across the floor, he saw something that chilled him more than the mountain air. A trail of wet, dark footprints led from the heavy wooden door of the basement, winding across the linoleum toward the sink. The prints were bare, the size of a grown man's feet, and the water was still glistening, as if whoever made them had just stepped out of a freezing lake. Elias checked the front door and the back door. Both were bolted from the inside. The windows were frozen shut, sealed by layers of ice. There was no way anyone could have entered or left without leaving a trace in the fresh snow outside. A desperate, irrational hope began to bloom in his chest, overshadowing his common sense. Grief has a way of making the impossible seem plausible. What if his brother hadn't really died? What if the hospital had made a mistake? Or what if this was something beyond the understanding of the living? He whispered his brother's name into the darkness, his voice cracking with emotion. There was no verbal response, only that familiar whistle again, drifting up from the black moor of the basement stairs. The sound was inviting, almost playful, tugging at the strings of his memories. He remembered how they would hide in the cellar during summer storms, laughing as the thunder rolled overhead. Now that same cellar felt like a gateway to something ancient and hungry. Elias moved toward the basement door, the air growing colder with every step he took. The basement was a place of unfinished concrete and cobwebs, filled with the relics of their childhood. He descended the stairs slowly, the lantern light dancing wildly against the stone walls. The whistling stopped as he reached the bottom. The basement was silent, save for the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky pipe. In the far corner, tucked behind an old furnace, he saw a silhouette. It was tall and lanky, leaning against a support beam in the exact way his brother used to when he was waiting for Elias to finish his chores. "Is that you?" Elias asked, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The figure didn't move at first. Then it began to speak. The voice was a perfect replica of his brother's, warm and slightly raspy. It spoke a secret, a sentence only the two of them had ever shared during a long night spent camping in these very mountains 20 years ago. It was a confession about a girl they both liked, something never written down and never repeated to another soul. The familiarity of the words washed over Elias, and he stepped forward, tears blurring his vision. He wanted to believe. He needed to believe that the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed. But as he drew closer, the lantern light finally reached the figure's face. It wasn't a face at all. The features were blurred and shifted like melting wax, the eyes too wide and the mouth a jagged, dark slit that didn't move when the voice emerged. The thing was a distorted entity, a mimic that wore his brother's clothes and used his brother's memories as bait. It wasn't his sibling standing there. It was a predator that had smelled his grief from across the veil. The entity's limbs elongated, its fingers stretching into pale, thin needles as it stepped out of the shadows. The air in the basement suddenly felt heavy, smelling of damp earth and rot. The entity let out one final whistle, but this time the sound was distorted, echoing with the screams of 1,000 different voices. Elias tried to back away, but his heels caught on a loose stone. He fell backward, the lantern slipping from his hand and crashing onto the concrete. The light flickered, the bulb dying as the glass shattered. In the final second of illumination, he saw the entity lunge toward him, its distorted face inches from his own. Then, the basement plunged into absolute darkness, leaving him alone with the thing that knew all his secrets. While the darkness in the Appalachian Mountains held its breath, miles away in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of St. Jude's Hospital, a different kind of silence was festering. Sarah adjusted the collar of her blue scrubs, the fabric feeling heavy and abrasive against her skin after 12 grueling hours on her feet. It was 2:30 in the morning, the exact hour when the line between the living world and the afterworld always felt thinnest to those who walked these halls. She was working the graveyard shift in the West Wing, a section of the hospital that had been officially decommissioned 10 years ago and was now only used for overflow storage and the occasional long-term recovery patient who required isolation. The air here was static and heavy. It smelled of ancient floor wax and the sharp, biting scent of hospital-grade antiseptic that could not quite mask the underlying odor of dust, old paper, and something metallic that reminded her of dried blood. Sarah did not mind the isolation, though it often made the younger nurses quit within a week. In fact, she had volunteered for these lonely, haunted hours. Her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was currently fighting a rare and aggressive respiratory condition that required specialized treatments costing thousands of dollars every single month. Every extra hour Sarah spent walking these hollow, echoing halls was another day of hope purchased for her child. Her maternal love was a shield against the creepiness of the building, a fierce drive that pushed her through the exhaustion. But tonight, that shield felt precariously thin, as if the very walls were leaning in to listen to her heartbeat. The overhead lights flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing hum, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to dance and stretch just at the edge of her peripheral vision. The oppressive silence was suddenly punctured by a sharp electronic chirp that made Sarah jump. She froze in the middle of the hallway, her eyes darting to the master console at the nurse's station. A single red light was blinking rhythmically. It was a patient call button from room 402. A cold shiver traveled down her spine, settling in the small of her back. Room 402 was at the very end of the long, dark corridor, and it had been empty for over a decade. The bed inside was stripped down to the rusted metal mattress frame, and the old medical equipment was unplugged and covered in thick, yellowed plastic sheets. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the rising tide of unease in her chest. She grabbed her heavy plastic clipboard and walked down the corridor, the squeak of her rubber-soled shoes echoing like gunshots against the polished linoleum. When she reached the room, the air felt noticeably colder, as if she had stepped into a walk-in freezer. She pushed the heavy door open, the hinges screaming in protest. She scanned the dark corners with her flashlight, the beam cutting through a decade of dust motes. She saw nothing but shadows. The call button cord was draped over the side of the metal bed frame, the plastic casing cracked with age. Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and pressed the reset switch. She watched the light go out and let out a long, shaky sigh. It was probably just a short circuit in the ancient wiring, she told herself. Old buildings like this were full of electrical ghosts. But as she turned her back to leave, the red light on the wall behind her snapped back on with a loud, aggressive click. The chirp from the hallway console followed a second later, louder this time and more insistent. Sarah felt a prickle of genuine cold fear. She reset it again, her breath hitching in her throat. This time, she did not leave immediately. She stood in the center of the room, her ears ringing with the intensity of the silence. Then, from the hallway, she heard a sound that did not belong in a decommissioned wing. It was the faint, rhythmic rattle of gurney wheels rolling slowly across the floor. It was a heavy, metallic sound, accompanied by the intermittent squeal of a rusted bearing. She stepped out into the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the corridor was completely empty. However, as she looked at the glass partition of the nearby observation station, she saw a reflection that stopped her heart. A small shadow, no taller than a child, was standing directly behind her in the reflection. It was a dark, blurred shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. When Sarah spun around with a gasp, there was only the empty, dimly lit hallway and the smell of stale air. The sense of being watched grew heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She hurried back toward the nurse's station, hoping to distract herself with paperwork and the familiar glow of the computer monitor. That was when she saw it. Lying directly on top of her open clipboard was a piece of paper that had not been there 5 minutes ago. It was a drawing, done in the shaky, colorful strokes of a child's crayon. It depicted a woman in blue scrubs holding the hand of a little girl in a hospital bed. The little girl in the drawing had the exact same blonde curls and bright blue eyes as Sarah's daughter, Lily. At the bottom of the page, written in jagged, oversized black letters that seemed to vibrate on the paper, were the words, "Help me." Panic surged through Sarah's veins like ice water. She pulled her phone from her pocket to call the home nurse who was looking after Lily. But there was no signal. Only a wall of white noise that sounded like 1,000 voices whispering at once. The lights in the long hallway began to burst, one by one, popping with a sound like light bulbs in a microwave. The darkness rushed toward her from both ends of the wing, swallowing the doors and the carts and the chairs. In the final, fading light of the station, Sarah saw the child's shadow again. But as it moved closer, she realized it was not a child at all. The figure began to distort and elongate, its limbs stretching and its torso twisting at impossible, bone-breaking angles. It was not a ghost of a past patient seeking comfort. It was something else entirely, a malevolent force that had been waiting in the abandoned, forgotten corners of St. Jude's for a very long time. It fed on the purest, most vulnerable emotions it could find, and Sarah's desperate, sacrificial love for her dying daughter was a feast it could not resist. The entity began to manifest more clearly now, taking on the blurred and horrifying likeness of Lily. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, dragging one long, pale foot behind it as it hissed her name. Sarah scrambled backward, her mind screaming that this was an illusion, but her maternal instincts were being weaponized against her. She could not stop her heart from aching at the sight of her daughter's face, even if the eyes were empty black pits. She ducked into the medication room, the only door with a heavy, reinforced electronic lock. She slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The room was small and cramped, filled with shelves of glass vials and plastic syringes. She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands, praying for the sun to rise and burn the shadows away. Then, she heard it. A soft, muffled voice coming from the ventilation shaft directly above her head. It was unmistakable. It was Lily's voice, small and fragile, crying out in pain and confusion. "Mommy, it is so cold in here," the voice whispered, echoing through the metal ductwork. "Please let me out, Mommy. I cannot breathe." Sarah looked up at the dark metal grate of the vent, her hand instinctively reaching for the door handle to go find her. She knew her daughter was miles away in her own bed, safe and asleep. But the sound was so perfect and so heartbreakingly real that her resolve began to crumble. Just as her fingers brushed the cold metal of the lock, she realized the voice was not coming from a person at all. It was coming from the thing outside, mimicking the one sound it knew she could never ignore. Sarah pulled her hand back, but the voice in the vent grew louder and more desperate, turning into a guttural, distorted screech that vibrated through the very walls of the room. She was trapped in the dark, and the thing that knew her greatest fear was just inches away, separated only by a thin layer of steel. While Sarah was trapped in the cold, sterile rooms of St. Jude's, another kind of isolation was unfolding in the heart of the city. Julian sat in his new living room, the blue light of 2 computer monitors reflecting off his glasses. He was a freelance editor, a man who spent his life cutting together the stories of others, while his own felt like it had been shredded. Apartment 4B was a sleek, minimalist space in a modern high-rise building. It was surprisingly cheap, a fact he had attributed to his own luck after a messy and draining divorce. He needed this fresh start. He needed to prove to himself that he could survive on his own, without the noise and the arguments that had defined his last 3 years. But as the clock on his screen shifted to 2 in the morning, the silence of the apartment felt less like peace and more like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The city lights outside his window were a blurred tapestry of amber and white, but they felt 1,000 miles away. Julian rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his coffee, which had long since gone cold. He was working on a documentary about urban legends, the irony not lost on him as he scrubbed through footage of haunted forests. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was coming from his bedroom, specifically from the wall behind his massive vintage oak wardrobe. At first, he tried to dismiss it as the building settling or perhaps a neighbor hanging a picture at an unreasonable hour. But the sound was too deliberate. It was the sound of a fingernail clicking against wood. Julian stood up, his heart beginning to sink with the rhythm of the noise. He walked slowly into the bedroom, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The tapping stopped the moment he crossed the threshold. He stood perfectly still for 3 minutes, his breath held in his chest, waiting for the sound to return. When it finally did, it was more frantic, a scratching sound like something trying to claw its way through the drywall. Julian felt a surge of frustration and fear. He needed to know what was causing it. He braced his shoulder against the side of the heavy wardrobe and pushed with all his might. The wood groaned against the floor, and the furniture slowly slid aside, revealing a small, rectangular door that had been expertly hidden behind the wallpaper. It was a crawl space, a narrow utility access that was not mentioned in the floor plan. Julian's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone to use as a flashlight. He pushed the small door open, expecting to find dust and old pipes. Instead, he found a sanctuary of madness. The space was barely 3 feet wide, but it was lined with thick blankets to dampen sound. On the wall opposite the door, held up by pieces of yellowing tape, were hundreds of candid photographs. Julian felt his stomach turn as he leaned in closer. They were all photos of him. There was a photo of him sleeping from 3 nights ago. There was a photo of him eating cereal in the kitchen. There was even a photo of him currently sitting at his desk, taken from a hole so small he had never noticed it in the living room wall. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had not been alone for a single second since he moved in. He remembered the news reports from a month ago about the previous tenant, a man who had vanished without a trace, leaving his phone and wallet behind. The police had searched the building and found nothing. Now, looking at the half-eaten containers of food and the indentation in the blankets, Julian realized the man had never left. He had simply moved into the spaces between the walls. A cold draft brushed against the back of Julian's neck. He turned his head slowly, and there, at the far end of the narrow crawl space, a pair of eyes caught the light of his phone. The man was skeletal, his skin the color of old parchment, and his hair a matted mess of gray. He was crouched in a way that no human should be able to sustain, his limbs folded like a spider's. Before Julian could even scream, the man lunged forward with a guttural, wet snarl. Julian scrambled backward out of the crawl space, his heels catching on the carpet as the pale figure tumbled out into the bedroom. The struggle was frantic and silent, a desperate scramble for survival in the shadows. The man's grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers feeling like cold iron as they wrapped around Julian's throat. Julian thrashed, his hand finding a heavy glass award on his nightstand. He swung it blindly, feeling it connect with something soft. The man let out a hissed gasp and recoiled, giving Julian just enough time to bolt toward the living room. He did not head for the front door, knowing the man was faster and closer to the hallway. Instead, he ran for the glass doors of the balcony. He burst through them into the freezing night air, slamming the door behind him and holding it shut with his entire body weight. Inside, the pale figure pressed its face against the glass, leaving a greasy smear. Julian screamed for help, his voice echoing off the neighboring towers until lights began to flicker on in the windows across the street. By the time the police arrived and broke down the front door, the man was gone. They searched the crawl space, the vents, and the elevator shafts. But the previous tenant had vanished once again into the labyrinth of the building. Julian sat on the curb outside, wrapped in a thin emergency blanket, watching the flashing blue and red lights. He reached into his pocket to find his phone, but his fingers brushed against his keychain instead. He pulled it out and froze. The key to his new apartment was there, but the key to the small, temporary office he had just rented across town was missing. The sun began to rise over the city, but it brought no warmth to Julian's chest. He realized then that some shadows do not stay in the rooms where they are born. They follow you, hidden in the pockets of your life, waiting for the next quiet moment to begin the tapping again. He looked up at the high-rise building, and for the first time, he realized that every wall was just a thin veil, and he would never truly be alone again. Some silences are not empty. They are just waiting for you to look away, and once the trust in your own sanctuary is broken, it can never be truly repaired. Julian knew then that no matter where he moved, no matter how many locks he changed, the man who lived in the walls already knew the way inside. The night was over, but for Elias, Sarah, and Julian, the darkness was only just beginning to take root in their souls.